Good morning, and thank you for joining this webinar on digital supply chain management. Industry 4.0 has created a disruption and requires companies to rethink the way they design their supply chain. Several technologies like Internet of Things, the use of advanced robotics, and analytics of big data have emerged that are altering traditional ways of working. On top of this, customer expectations give a whole new perspective. Digitization is being looked at to address the new requirements of the customers, the challenges of the supply chain, as well as the remaining expectations in efficiency improvement. Today, we are in conversation with Mr. Pankaj Kumar Singh. Mr. Singh is the Global Solution Lead for Supply Chain at the India Global Center of Excellence for the Coca-Cola Company. He is responsible for designing, developing, and supporting supply chain solutions for bottling operations in Asia Pacific countries. He has been with the Coca-Cola Company for over 9 years. He is an IT professional, having over 20 years of diverse experience across industries, including automotive, manufacturing, services, and CPG. He has worked with organizations like SAP, GE, and Mahindra in functional and IT leadership roles. Mr. Singh is a BTech from IIT Kharagpur and MBA from IIFT. Throughout his career, he has been focused on delivering innovative business solutions for business operations. He has an innate ability for people development and has always mentored his teams to achieve their full potential. Welcome, Mr. Singh. In today's world, the supply chain is a multifaceted ecosystem that links product development, manufacturing, and distribution networks into one fully transparent and digitized system. Studies suggest that an interconnected digital supply chain can lower operational costs, reduce lost sale opportunities, and even reduce inventory requirements, all while making companies faster, more agile, granular, accurate, and efficient. Before I invite Mr. Singh, I would like to request the audience to please send in your questions as and when they occur in your mind. I invite Mr. Singh now to enlighten us about digital supply chain.
So, thank you, ma'am, and thank you, IILM University, for inviting me for this wonderful webinar. And in these times, this topic is quite appropriate as the supply chains are getting reconfigured. And during lockdown, it's the supply chain that is the most important element of our lives, because if the goods do not reach us, then it's very difficult for us to survive the lockdown. So as you would imagine that without supply chain, it's very difficult to manage. And as we grow connected, as you said, we are getting faster, more agile, which has been the key to customer experience all throughout history. So I'll be talking on this fascinating subject, and it will be quite bite-sized because topic is quite vast. Each topic is in a subject in itself. So I'll share my experiences and I'll build it up from a basic fundamental, give the basics of supply chain, and then the journey towards digital supply chain, and most appropriately, what is important for this audience is what is the skill set that would be required going forward, because the world is changing very fast, changing every day, actually changing every instant as we speak. New algorithms get designed. So people also, the supply chain is agile as well as people have to be agile. Their thoughts and mindset have to be agile. So they cannot be fossilized, and so keep on evolving. So what skill set do we need to develop within ourselves for our team to survive in this world? And finally, I'll wrap it up with some key trends that is affecting the industry.
Yeah. So as I said, I'll be talking about basics of supply chain. the journey towards how the world has come to this digital supply chain with the revolution in mainly data and the algorithms that are driving this a journey towards digital supply chain. Uh, and what are the and some of the and I also talked about skill sets for future managers in supply chain domain. And some of, even though the world is changing around us very fast, but some of the fundamentals will remain the same. So the fundamentals will not change. And if we do not have a very sound understanding of the theory behind them, so we will swim in the unknown quite and not having something to catch on. So those fundamentals also need to be dwelt on, and the current generation of young leaders should focus on them as well. And then obviously some of the key trends that we will be building upon on those fundamentals. So having said that, we'll just, and as you would all know, the basic of supply chain. So basically there are many jargons that would we'll keep hearing. So IoT, blockchain, but we do not, first we need to understand what actually supply chain is at its core. So at its core, the supply chain is a flow of information and material which travel through a sequence or a network of suppliers and reach the customer. So the customer initiates the information flow, which travels upward towards the chain of suppliers. And then on the reverse side, the materials start flowing towards the customer. It could be material or it could be services. So this is basically at its core the supply chain, and the whole premise of an efficient supply chain is to make this flow faster, both information as well as material. And if one is fast, the other is not fast, then we land up in trouble. So people try to make say with the improvement in software technology as well as information science, the flow of information has become quite fast. But correspondingly, if the material is not moving fast enough, if the logistics is a constraint, then you end up with a bottleneck. So that we need to understand. So, and which at sometimes in the thick of things we forget. So, and then this supply chain is structured according to the industry that we operate in. There is no one size fit all supply chain for each different industry. So there are various kind of industries. People have defined industries in various ways. So there could be a V type of industry, there could be A type of industry, there could be a T type of industry. So V type of industry is where basically you have very less raw material and you have a plethora of finished goods coming out at the other end. So typical example being steel. So steel, you have very less raw material. You have only limestone, coke, and these are the key raw materials. Whereas you have steel coming at the other end with various SKUs. So there could be hundreds of SKUs with different lengths, with different thickness. And the challenges in managing those kind of supply chain would be very different than managing the supply chain in a kind of industry. So a kind of industry would be where you have many raw material. It's the reverse of B. So you could have different, a large amount of raw material coming in and very few products getting manufactured. So the end product would be very few in number. The SKUs would be very few in number. So typical example being project industry. So you will have, say, a power plant being erected at a site. So you have different material. So based on the sequence of the construction schedule, you will have the material coming in which has to come out the right time at the right sequence. So if one material comes in early, which has to be assembled later, then it doesn't help the supply chain. So this supply chain has to be managed very differently than a V type of industry. And then you have a T type of industry, which again is quite different. So T type of industry would be an assembly industry. So typical example being automotive. So you have an automotive industry where you have hundreds of raw materials coming in from different kind of vendor tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 vendors supplying to the OEM, and OEM in turn assembling the end product. So again, the complexity of managing a T type of industry is very different than a B type or A type of industry. And you would have heard in these times that we have different zones. So you have red zone, green zone, orange zone, and the OEM is saying that we cannot start because one of my vendors is in, if it is in red zone, though even if one part is not available at the right time, then it stops the whole assembly line. So a T-type, managing a T-type of industry would have its own challenges, and the focus of supply chain and the managers for each type of industry and skill set that would be required would be different. So, for example, in a T type of industry, you would have heard that just in time. So like in automotive industries, though just in time would be important for all industries, but is typically more focused on in a T type of industry where at the time of assembly, when a part is required, when a washer is required, then it is requested for and it is delivered at that point in time. But the case in point being now in times how this reconfiguration will happen because of COVID, because and how people react in future if they do not have inventory. So some of the industry which had raw material worth 1 month or 2 months and typical raw material coming from China were able to survive because they had 1 or 2 months of inventory. And if some industries which were operating on just in time and they did not have any material, so then they would have simply collapsed at this time. So people have to anticipate the industry environment also they are operating in. So this is a background of what supply chain is, how supply chains are configured in different kinds of industry. And then we'll move on to what is a typical. So, ma'am, if you have any questions, please keep on throwing them in. So we could have instead of having a monologue, we can have a dialogue going on.
Sure, sure.
So this is a typical supply chain structure. You would all be familiar with. We have a typical different vendors would be there supplying to different manufacturing plants. Then there would be regional stock yards. Then you would have dealers. Dealers would have interns, retailers, and then retailers supplying it to customers. This is a typical supply chain that, and in the end, we are having happy customers. So this is, if you see by the flow of arrows, it's a typical a linear supply chain, which we have understood all those all these years. And again, in this supply chain, again, the focus of say a T type of industry would be more on the vendor side, on the getting the material to the manufacturing plant in time. So that would be the key focus area. Whereas in a different kind of industry where distribution is more important, the focus would be on from manufacturing and to the regional stockyards or the depots. So distribution would become more important. So when I worked in automotive industry, the focus was completely on procurement, whereas in a say FMCG kind of environment where currently I'm working in, the focus is completely on distribution. So you have in a FMCG kind of environment, you have less raw material coming in, and you have a huge amount of customers to manage in. So the distribution becomes the key. So the focus is just the reverse. So instead of procurement, the focus becomes the distribution. So this we have to keep in mind as we move across. What are the typical elements which will not change? As I said, there are some things that will not change. Whatever data we have, whatever algos we will have, these things are the key, and everything that we do are these things to be managed. So inventory is one, cost is the other. The cycle time, which is effectively the lead time between each of these entities, or as nodes we can call. And all these signify basically opportunities of reducing waste in a supply chain. So as Japanese, and supply chain historically has been very influenced by the Japanese way of working. So as they said, muda is waste, and waste has to be removed. And so it can be removed only when things flow. So the supply chain has to be in constant motion. So if it is stuck, if it is stuck somewhere, inventory is piling up, that's a waste. And ultimately, the end objective of any supply chain manager is to reduce that waste and increase the flow, which is in turn the opportunity. And this has to be the focus all along. So we understood that what a supply chain is, different kinds of industry, what is a typical supply chain structure, and what are the key elements of the supply chain. Now I'll talk more about so basically, if you see supply chain, basically you can divide into say two basic areas. You will have the say planning side and you have the operation side. So this talks more about the planning side. So what are the different process steps within planning domain? So you start with customer demand, which is demand planning. So you know what's your likely demand going to be in next one year or 3 months or 13 weeks or a next 1 week. So this is how you will plan for those demand. Next would be the supply planning. So this demand will flow down to supply planning. Then you will create a master production schedule across all your plants. So you will know that within a time bucket of a day, what amount, what material needs to be manufactured, what SKU needs to be manufactured. And then supply planning again gives its input to production planning and detailed scheduling. So supply planning stops at day level planning. So your bucket size is a day. So you will be able to tell that this factory needs to produce Coke 500 ml, this much quantity. Whereas production planning and detailed scheduling will go on to the minute level planning. So it will tell what SKU will be produced at what time and which SKU will be produced in what line. So this is production planning and detailed scheduling. And then you will have daily stock deployment scheduling. So basically you already have produced the FG and then this needs to be distributed to your depots or to your stockyards. So this is your stock deployment scheduling. And again, you will know that the focus should be very different in different areas in different industries. So daily stock deployment would be more focused upon in a though other areas would also be important, but daily stock deployment would be more focused upon in the distribution oriented industry. And on the right side, you see are the execution steps. So you will have to differentiate between the planning steps and the execution steps. So planning systems are basically just a plan. They need to be executed by some activities actually happening in your ERP systems or on the actual shop floor. So the planning systems give input to your execution system. So production planning and detailed scheduling, when your actual production starts, then you will create an order and the order will be executed upon. And when the order gets completed, then the goods will be goods receipt will be done. So in that way, when you do a daily stock deployment planning, so the result of that planning, when you start executing, so you will call in the trucks and then you will start executing, you will create your stock transfers and then do a goods issue. So these are some of the steps, planning, and always planning and execution are interlinked. So this you would have seen is more towards a kind of planning environment, whereas there is other part where when we talk about manufacturing execution, so there is the operations. So that also is a component of supply chain. So where operations area where you need to actually schedule the machines, maintain the machines, do a maintenance on a daily, weekly basis of the machine. So that also would be part of your operations process, which comes under the gamut of supply chain. Moving on. So this, what I did was basically gave you an overview, a quick overview of a supply chain, and then we'll move how we are moving now towards a digital supply chain. So and as you have seen, now we are moving from a say linear supply chain to a circular supply chain. So anyone of today's generation will be very familiar with this kind of supply chain today. So supply chain is basically a circular supply chain with the evolution of e-commerce and m-commerce. So everything is interconnected. So you will have manufacturers going to a warehouse supplying to urban areas, to to rural areas through parcels, and then you will have to have recycling coming in. So you also you can return your goods as well. So when and buy something from Amazon and you don't like it, then you can return it. So that also in turn triggers a huge amount of back end work on the supply chain side. So instead of a linear supply chain, now it's becoming a circular supply chain. So either your returns have to be managed, or by law you have to do recycling. So many of the countries where Coke operates in, so you'll have to collect the bottles. So and there is a whole supply chain which caters to the returnable plastic bottles as well, PET, as we call PET bottles. So we already had returnable glass bottles, which is the glass which you drink Coke in, but also the PET also gets recycled. And if you think of it, just take an example of returnable glass bottles. So the returnable glass bottles have to be planned for. So I cannot produce Coke if my glass bottles are not available in factory, if they have not been collected and they have not been given back to the factory. So then I cannot produce the Coke which goes into as we call RGB bottles. So each industry now is facing that challenge. So Coke already had that challenge earlier, but now with recycling and focus on sustainability, that is becoming more important. And then that also requires the data to be analyzed when the customer is ordering, when he is returning, when it can be collected and taken back to the factory. So all those data needs to be analyzed. So the focus again is growing more on data. So that's how we are moving from a traditional to a digital supply chain. So it's becoming a circular economy, and basically in the earlier phases, as we said, the supply chain earlier focus was completely on efficiency. So with the industrial revolution, and when the economies of scale started happening in, so you had mass production. So and you could mass produce only with few models. So the mass production could have happened only for few models. So there is a classic quote of Henry Ford, who said, "I can give you any color as long as it is black." So that was for Model T. So there was no, so the whole focus, and Frederick Taylor, when he designed the supply chain, the focus was on efficiency. So basically basically at that time it was time and motion study. So basically you were focusing on time and motion, what amount of time each activity is taking, and then trying to reduce the amount of time that takes for each activity. So but in that thing, so when you are trying to reduce the cost, the preferences that the customers have had was lost. So and with over, and then the next phase came in. So the first phase, as you could see, was the mass production system, first initiated by Ford and copied by other industries as well. Even actually Henry Ford copied it from the meat cutting industry when he saw the conveyor belt moving. So actually Henry Ford took it from the meat cutting industry, and from automotive it went to other industries. And then in the 60s and 70s, the whole focus on quality came in, and with the Japanese way of working on reducing waste and just in time came in, and Japanese swept the world with their method of manufacturing. And the Toyota became a model company, and the Toyota production system became a way of life for many companies actually, and it got studied in detail. Toyota was ready to open its factory for other people, and then the whole lean revolution came from that. Actually, James Womack went to study the Toyota production, and he wrote that the machine that changed the world, and that was on Toyota production system. And later on, he wrote Lean Thinking, and from there the lean thinking came in. And then came also another stream, which was the other way of looking at things at it, is the Six Sigma way. So all these things converged in 80s, but Now in 90s, and then when internet revolution came in, then there was an explosion of data and the customer choices became more important, and the supply chain had to cater to that. So as I earlier mentioned, so when I gave you the overview of the planning function, so you had demand planning flowing into supply planning. So basically you are forecasting the future demand, and the future demand, again, you have a time bucket. You can do it for 3 months, you can do it for 1 week. But now with internet and other things, m-commerce coming in, you have to have it very agile. You have to sense the demand which is likely to happen. So and you can see the different use cases, like in Coke, if I uh, uh, say open a fridge, so at what time the fridge is opened in a shop, what is the temperature, and during say 12 o'clock and to 1 o'clock the demand is high. So I know that kind of I can collect that kind of data. So that in this shop, in this time, uh, and based on the weather conditions, the demand is so much, and then I need to react on that. So from a sales forecasting perspective, it came more towards demand sensing in the real time. So can I analyze the POS data, point of sale data, and act on that? And you already have seen the linear supply chain, which I showed earlier. So the linear supply chain is now getting converted into an agile ecosystem. So basically, in the linear supply chain, as I said, the flow of material and information is linear. So one chain transmits the data or the material to the other chain. Whereas in a collaborative supply chain, there could be a co-packer which can supply directly to my customers, and the information, and it's just the information that comes to the OEM. So I can ask my co-packer to produce directly ship to a customer. The goods, even without coming to me, gets delivered to the customer, and but my system has to keep track of that. So it's becoming a very ecosystem kind of thing, and information flow has to happen, has to be managed and tracked. I need to know whether my co-packer has supplied to the customer or not, at what time it supplied to the customer. So which earlier was not there because it was a linear supply chain. So we have moved from a, say, if you see, you have moved from a completely forecasting to a sensing demand, from a linear supply chain to an agile ecosystem. And I have already talked about from a mass production to a mass customization, because now I can have a cloth of any color, any size which I want, and I can order in an instance at the press of a button, and it in turn triggers a whole amount of back-end work which happens. So that's how, and all the behind all this change is the huge amount of data which is coming in, and how the data has to be analyzed and to be executed upon. So this is how this now supply chain is structured. And what I have been talking about, I've been taking my experience from the various technology partners that I have worked in the past, mainly, and one of them being SAP. So I have borrowed the ideas heavily from SAP. So just a disclaimer here, some of these ideas are borrowed heavily from SAP, and whatever you are seeing, some of the ideas are basically some of the product offerings from SAP or some other partners. So if you see, this is how now in already the supply chains are getting structured. So you will have to have customer experience. The digital core, whatever stocks, is the execution system. So where all your execution is happening. And all across you will have network and spend management if you look at the top. So as I said, agile ecosystem. So basically you will have to manage your network. So you are not managing now your company itself, but you are managing the network. So you are managing the complete supply chain. So when your ERP came in, so ERP was basically removing the walls between the different departments within the company. So basically finance and so you will add, company had one data. So finance also worked with the same data as supply chain, and marketing also worked with the same data. But now it's not the only the four walls within the company that is working with one data, but it's the whole ecosystem of customers as well as suppliers who are working with the same data. And these are being driven at the bottom end is the different AI, machine learning, analytics, and IoT techniques that are getting developed. So most of the changes are getting driven upon are by these technologies. So when I talked about when I can get to know that within 12 to 1 o'clock, say in Gurgaon, in this shop, the fridge got opened so many times and so many bottles got sold. So that can happen through an IoT platform. So the fridge can send the data to a server, and then that data gets to my backend, and then it can be analyzed. So the different algorithms can analyze that data. And if you see, then to support these kind of explosion in data, you need to have efficient data management, because you are working with a huge amount of data set, and this data set has to be cleaned. Your material master has to be cleaned. So your data management, without a fundamental core efficient data management, you will not be able to do any of these stuff. And everybody of you would have heard of cloud. So it is now imperative because of cost implications, and more so in these times, that all these things are getting moved onto the cloud platform. So there are these technology providers who are giving these, even just take the example of Zoom here. So they are able to cater to the explosion in their usage just because of cloud. So because a huge amount of usage started happening in, and then they could add the server spaces and the computing power in the cloud, which if the company would have tried to manage on its own, would not have been able to do it. So it's basically a shared space which people are getting used. So it's becoming efficient, and so you could cater to your demand fluctuations quite easily. So because of your e-commerce demand fluctuation which is happening, you could when you would have a IPL season where you see a surge in demand, any consumer demand, then you could cater to because you could have that physical infrastructure which is there in place. In India also we had that example of Paytm, which was able to cater to that demand of demand because they had the cloud available with them.
So one of the questions that has cropped up is that this entire revolution, this Industry 4.0 revolution, this is sort of based on an interconnected world where digitization will ride on top of existing complex supply chain systems. So you referred to SAP and Oracle. And how open, however, are these different systems to enable handshake with new applications or systems? I mean, also, different players might be playing a role currently in companies for each of these functional activities. How easy is it for those players to sort of connect and upgrade themselves to the requirements of the system?
So these companies are becoming also very open now. So they cannot afford to be proprietary. So they are opening up their infrastructure. They are opening up and they are giving APIs. So you can use their APIs and create your own applications as well. So basically what is happening over is that all these technology providers are kind of becoming platform providers. So they are giving you the platform, they are giving you the base infrastructure, and then giving you the flexibility to develop even your own applications. And that application might be within within their domain, but you can also develop it on your own. So you could host even a SAP on a different cloud provider. SAP will host, it will give it you on its own cloud. You can host it on your private cloud and to some other public cloud provider. You can, they are giving a cloud platform where you can take their data out from SAP and create your own, say, leave application or time application. So each technology provider is kind of becoming a platform provider and allowing the customers to develop their own applications. So that's how the world is evolving, and it has to, because no company can think of or deliver all the solutions. And as I talked about, there are different kinds of supply chain. Each customer has its unique challenge. So a big technology provider cannot develop everything, cannot be best of breed in every area. So there are best of breed people coming up, and then there are these technology providers who are giving space to develop your own best of breed application. That's how the world is evolving.
So another question by Vinay has been posted, and he asks, what is the scope of supply chain?
So scope of supply chain, as I talked about. So basically, yeah, so very good question. So you have to be fundamentally very clear. So fundamentally, what is supply chain, which I talked in the beginning? It's the flow of material and services. And whatever come under this domain will fall under the domain of supply chain. So anything which is flowing, any material or service which is flowing to your consumer and customer will fall under the domain of supply chain. Does that answer the question, or is Vinay satisfied, or he needs more elaboration?
I think we can continue, and then I'm sure if there are more questions, they'll keep propping up.
Yeah, sure. So moving on. So this is again basically, as I talked about the planning flow when I gave in, and I talked about the demand, supply, production, and execution. And then I talked about how we are converting from a linear supply chain to a agile ecosystem. So again, the software, and as I said, the technology providers are becoming platform providers and giving best of the and giving space to customers to develop their applications. But they in turn are also reconfiguring and coming out with new solutions. So this is how a typical this is from SAP. So they have a planning software called IBP. Similarly, JDA is having its own supply chain suite. So, and they will have counterpart to each of these modules. So this is how a typical planning solution organization looks like. So you will have supply chain control tower, which sits at the top, which is getting data from each of these different application areas, which is sales and the first is sales and operations planning. Sales and operations planning is basically a combination of your basically a meeting which happens between your manufacturing folks and sales folks, where they take that based on the based on the current demand and based on the supply network constraint, what is the things that we can produce and satisfy, and what would its impact on the balance sheet or P&L be. So this is where sales and operations meeting happened, and these sales and operations, as you said, as I said, this is a data meeting between sales operations team and manufacturing and finance team. So it would have input from all these below towers, which is the demand planning and the inventory planning, response and supply planning. So inventory, as you demand, I have already talked about in some detail. Inventory now, earlier it was very difficult to do a say multi-echelon inventory planning. So multi-echelon meaning so in each node, what is the optimum level of safety stock that you need to keep. So earlier, with the constraint of data and computing power that I had, it was very difficult to decide on an optimal safety stock level. But now with these software solutions, it is becoming easier to arrive at these safety stock planning scenarios at each nodes within your supply chain, and even in, as I said, in your network. So you could have also, you can ask your suppliers what safety stock optimally they should have based on the lead time and the variability in demand which is there. and then allocations and deployment planning. So basically allocations would be basically if I have more demand and less supply, then how would I allocate so that some of the I satisfy most of the customers and which customer I cannot satisfy, so that I determine. So all those things are becoming more important. So when you order at the say e-commerce platform, so a, a quick available to promise check happens, because whether and it happens in the background whether that material is there or not. But for that to happen, the system has to set up. So this is how a typical your planning environment will look like. This is how it is evolving, as I talked about. So I've already, we are already in this multi-enterprise collaboration area. So individual customer experience. So with Coke now you can order in some countries where you can order your name printed on the Coke bottle. If I have to cater to that demand, then I have to plan for that. So this is how the evolution is happening. Multi-enterprise, big data and predictive capabilities. So predictive capabilities, again, earlier when I used so some of the algos are now getting more, the algos are there, but now it's getting more sophisticated. So basically now you, instead of taking a monthly data, you have the benefit of taking an hourly data as well and analyzing, and then you have AI techniques which can give you better results than a statistical technique that you earlier employed. So deep neural networks and some of the things that we have tried have worked much better in this regard. So AI can help in this even in demand planning in a very automated way.
So one question by Mr. Sharma is, how do you think Industry 4.0 will change the scope of work of small-scale industries or Tier 2 suppliers for OEMs? I think it will take some time for them to come aboard. That is the question. So we're talking about technology and AI, and with respect to Tier 2 suppliers, it may not be easy for them to come aboard.
So I agree, and that brings me to the next point. I agree to a large extent with that point, because it will take some time for these Industry 4.0 to come to these as SMEs, because it is now some of the OEMs are trying it out, and it's in the initial stage of adoption. So if you look at other countries like Germany and Japan, Germany particularly, so it's their SMEs which are the engines of the drivers of the economy, and they are quite advanced. Most of the cutting edge technologies are employed by all the SMEs in Germany, which should be the goal of India as well. But I agree with Mr. Sharma that it will take time because obviously investment is a constraint. So with still there is always a arbitrage between technology and these are my personal views. So there is always a arbitrage between labor cost and capital investment on technology. So as long as that labor arbitrage is there, so it will take time. So you could hear people saying that I can employ say 5 people to do this activity, whereas the technology itself will cost more than that. So that discussion and that focus and that to and fro between cost and technology will be there, and until and unless that cost arbitrage is there, that adoption will be less in SMEs. But if we have to go ahead and become an export-oriented country as we should, then the focus has to be accordingly.
So a related question by Mr. Manish Mathur is, how do we offset the cost of digitization in the current market conditions? And speaking of current market conditions, there's also a question by Mr. SB that please tell us the effect of this pandemic on supply chain industry. So
So the cost of digitization, obviously, the cost is coming down exponentially, and there is no doubt about it. It will happen on its own pace. So if you see, and if you and one classic example is the smartphone that you use or we use is more powerful than the computers that sent the lunar mission, Apollo mission to the moon. That it's an exponentially. So the cost is decreasing exponentially. So and uh, the computing power, the Moore's law. So with every year, the computing power gets doubled. Has held on it till this date, and it's going to hold on. People said that it's breaking now, but it's holding now. It's still holding now, and with quantum computing, it will hold in future as well. So it will come on its own. It's just that we don't realize it. It will happen on its own pace. It's just that the labor cost of digitization is coming. So if you look at the ERP implementation in 90s, so there used to be multi-million projects. They are coming down now. Cloud is one of the major cost factor of bringing the cost of digitization down. So I don't see any challenges happening in getting this done. Some of the SMEs can afford ERP systems on cloud, which earlier they could not. With the new technology coming in, the cost will effectively come down. The other question on the pandemic, it's anybody's guess how it will be reconfigured. The people are saying that industries will move from China. So if you look, most of the industries went to China because of the ease in doing business and infrastructure. So it's a difficult call. It's a call which is still open and cannot be answered. Cannot be answered without having a looking glass. So I couldn't. My guess would be as good as Mr. Sharma's. So moving on. So I have talked about how much time do we have left? 10 minutes. So I'll have to speed up. So basically, moving on, as we have focused on the planning bit, and as I said, we on the operation side also, and as I just talked about the cost of digitization. So the one of the things people are now doing is the connected asset. So IoT would play a big role. Cost is coming down with of IoT as well. The digital assets, the physical assets will have now twin digital assets. So instead of doing any permutation and combination, trying out different permutation and combination parameters on machines, you can try it on the digital twin first and see how it works. So that's the next wave that would happen. So a connected asset is basically driven by IoT. Is one of the examples, like if I have to see how my machine operates with a certain pressure parameter. Currently, I need to do it physically, try it out on machine, which takes time. And if I have a digital twin on that, then I can simulate it, and it will help me identify which pressure parameter works best. And all the more the AI, and there are certain startups, and one of the ways which cost will come down will be the startup ecosystem, because they will be working in niche areas with very deep skill sets and will be bringing these costs down. So there will be AI algos which will be able to identify in this digital twin which is the best parameter for which this machine to work on, which pressure and what is the best temperature and pressure parameter. So this is how the digitization will come within the shop floor. So currently that I would say that in the planning area, there has been a lot of digitization already, but not much on the asset side. on the factory floor side, but which again would happen in more detail now. This is an example which you can look at of IoT. I have taken an example of a pallet, and when you are not in a particular industry, you will not know what kind of cost is in a very small thing. So the pallet on which Coke gets delivered is is basically contributes to a lot of cost. So with blockchain and IoT, you will be able to know where my pallet is at each instant, at which depot, at which distributor. So I could exchange my pallets with another transportation company, and this in turn will reduce my cost. Basically, what happens in supply chain is that the more the asset is utilized, the more the cost will come down. So a typical example being, say, a Uber or an Ola, where or a airline, where the more the car is on the road or the airplane is on the basically on the in the sky, the more the cost will be coming down for the consumer, and it happens in all the supply chains. So if the pallet, instead of residing at the distributor, is coming back to me faster with the blockchain technology, and I know where it is, then I will be able to utilize it more optimally. This is an example of how basically blockchain will help you in identifying, which is a big key fake pharma. So in COVID times also, it's important in the sense that the fake drug. So how can I trace the authenticity of the drug? So with the blockchain, you will be able to identify each instant which node of the supply chain it was, and then what happened to that shipment. When did it leave the gates of the manufacturers? When did it leave the gates of the customers? So in that way, you will be able to trace back globally across the supply chain each product. So this, which will help in bringing the confidence within the supply chain. This is an example of IoT. So basically, IoT is what? It basically, the first wave was of connecting the people. So with internet, people got connected, and now with Industry 4.0, what we have been talking about is this blockchain and IoT technology, which is basically connecting the assets. So there will be billions of physical assets that is getting connected. So even a typical example of being your TV or your tube light, which is getting connected. So these are all examples of these smart assets, which is getting utilized based on when it is needed. So there is an equipment, there is a vending machine. So vending machine transmits data. It could be either through GSM technology or whatever technology. So it transmits the data. The data is cleansed in the edge systems. Then it is transmitted to the cloud, and then it comes to the business applications where this data is aggregated and made sense is made. When I talked about when I can know now that 12 to 1 o'clock, what is the usage of my Coke, which fridge sold how much, that would be through IoT technology. So some of the examples, one of the cities in Germany, for example. So they are in the waste collection system. So they are doing, they have put sensors in the dustbins, and when it is full, then it transmits the data. The waste collecting company knows that is full, and then it sends the truck accordingly. Earlier I said the Japanese way of working. So the Japanese way of working was more on a visual system. So they said Kanban and other things. So the focus was on visual system. So now that visual system, so the software component was less. So they could see the bin empty, and it was a trigger to send a trigger to the supplier that the bin is empty and they need to produce, they need to send the material. So now that trigger can come through that IoT. So the bin could have a sensor attached to it, and the bin gets empty. The sensor sends the data to the purchase manager saying that this material is over, you need to order it to the material, or the ordering can happen directly to the supplier. So in this way, there could be based on your ingenuity, you can think of the use case. So that flexibility with that computing power is available now, which was not earlier. So you can think of, you can actually not think of, you can dream of any use case, and you can make sense out of it and actually implement it. So that's the power that we are at today. So the most important thing, skill sets for future managers. Some of the things you cannot. Most of these things fundamentally actually sit on, basically you are analyzing data and trying to eliminate waste. So the lean is a very important principle on that. So you have to see the value stream. I talked about the value stream in quite detail across different. So the material has to flow. It has to be pulled from the customer. So when I said that AI will have that prediction technologies, basically what you are saying is that customer is pulling that the material, and people will have to be empowered. So people have to be the future supply chain managers will have to have confidence and the ability to analyze data, need to have the fundamentals of their supply chain in place. What is lean? What is Six Sigma? What is the different ways of analyzing data? So any project that you do, any implementation that you do can happen on a DMAC way. So you define what is important to the customer, you measure what are your defects rate, you analyze, you improve upon the process. So improvement, what you are trying at the end of the day is you improvement of the process. So if you saying that you are reducing waste, actually you are improving the customer, you are actually improving the process. And then when the process is improved, you have to control them. So these things would be important. I need also to talk about technology. Supply chain, most of the innovations has happened through technology. So there's a hype cycle. So technology undergoes a hype cycle. So some technologies is hyped up and then does not give that result. Then there is a plateau of trough of disillusionment. And then again, when it stabilizes, because in the initial phases, there will be some hiccups. So when you are over through that hiccup, then you are able to use it on a running basis. So you could read this if you are not, I'm not very sure if you are able to read it through. So this is taken from Gartner. So Gartner comes out with some of the leading technologies which are there and the hype cycle. So on the left side, you have on the left bottom, you have the planning magic quadrant, which are the companies which are in the leading quadrant. So you have in the planning systems, you have JDA, Logility, Kinaxis, you have also SAP. So each, and I also talked about planning system and execution system. So execution also comes within the supply chain. So within execution, you will have, so planning, I said there will be demand, supply, response, inventory. Whereas in the execution side, you will have warehouse management, you will have transportation management. So on the right side, you see the magic quadrant for the transportation system. So again, you have Oracle, JDA, SAP, the future, the usual suspects which are there. Now bringing, so as we come to the close, so some of the key trends we have already talked about. The supply chain digitization is happening. Cloud was a big earlier big thing. So now its adoption has increased to a huge scale. So much so that most of the big companies are on cloud. They have no, except for some defense or public sector, most of the companies are moving to the cloud or have already moved to the cloud. Omni-channel, so my suppliers delivering to the, I going to the shop to buy or ordering from the smartphone. Sustainability, as we talked about, is becoming critical. Circular supply chain, we have already talked about. Agility is important. IoT connected devices are important. Big data is driving everything, and reconfiguration of global supply chain, which is important for India if we are able to pull it off with the shops that we are giving, so production incentives that we are giving to the new companies and the tax cuts we have given. So it will be if we are able to pull it off, then it will be good for future supply chain managers, give them a lot of jobs. So all these trends, we overestimate what we can do in 1 year, but underestimate what we can do in 10 years. So we think that we'll be able to do it in 1 year, but are not able to do it, get dejected, but it gets done. So over a long period of time, all these changes get done. That's the way of life. That's how humanity has evolved and prospered. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. We have a lot of questions coming up, so I'll quickly take a couple of them just because of paucity of time. We may not be able to take all, but a few of them I would like to certainly mention here. So Mr. Nandan Singh has asked, how has rapidly changing technology impacted supply chain management? And a related question is, would request a little, this is by Dr. Tripti Toor, would request a little more insight on digitization of supply chain, unlocking circular economy. So if you could reiterate these points once more.
So how technology has impacted supply chain. So as I talked about earlier, and I gave an example of say Japanese way of working where the focus was less on software and more on say visual systems. So a card used to be, say, for example, a Kanban way of working. So a card is attached to the bin, and when the bin gets empty, then the card comes to the worker brings the card to the supply chain manager, and then he in turn triggers the gives the trigger to the vendor. But it can now be done through an IoT way of working. So you have a sensor attached to it, the bin gets empty, and the trigger goes to the vendor. So earlier these cards, when we used, so it could the first wave of digitization, so these cards were scanned and then sent to the supplier on email. So that was part of technology. Earlier they used to travel physically on truck, so that these trucks are going to the vendor, and then they get that trigger. But with email coming in, so then these communication went through email. And the next wave is through IoT, so that the bin gets empty and it gets directly triggered to the consumer on the internet. So that's how in each area the information flow is. As I said, information flow we are able to bring faster through adoption of technology. But it's important with physical process how we are able to match the movement of material with this increase of flow of material. So if I am able to give the trigger to the vendor instantly, so it does not help me if when the vendor supplies and gets stuck at the border or somewhere. So the material has to move also fast. So people have to understand that information flow and technology flow both have to be, material flow has to be in tandem.
So another question by Professor Sangeeta Samli is, how do you expect AI to revolutionize supply chain systems? So you have touched upon this, if you could reiterate this.
So as I said, basically now AI gives you the power to dream of anything and it can be done. So if AI is a image processing, so you can defect management. So you could take images on your shop floor as the material is getting produced, and you can analyze the images through AI, and they can tell that whether the machine parameter is okay or not based on the images that they study. So it's the image processing can be used in multiple ways. So image processing can be used to detect your cancer. Image processing can be used to detect your defects on the shop floor. So in that way, the AI. So this same technique of image processing, also the neural network can be used to predict your customer demand. So you will have different data coming in of the consumption of your product, and then AI can analyze that data and tell you what your future demand is going to be. So you can think of any use case and it can be implemented through AI. So that was the first question. What was the other one?
This was about AI only. Other was insight on digitization of supply chain, unlocking the circular economy. This was by Dr. Tripti Toor.
the circular economy also touched upon most of these supply chain now, instead of just supplying of products, is also now focusing on services. So as we focus on services, so because acquiring new customers is more expensive than keeping the existing customers, and you can keep the existing customers happy with the service that you provide. And this service that you provide is basically dependent on the circular economy. So it to and fro communication with the consumer that will happen. So basically when you return a product, so that product has to be, so if you, the return process is happy for the consumer or the customer, then he or she becomes your lifelong consumer. And that can happen only with the smart analytics and smart way you can analyze the data. So why this customer returned the product, what you can do better in that product, what was the reason, can you mitigate that reason? All these needs data, and you need to be able to track what was the defect, and that tracking can be done only through data. So again, that and for Coke, if any say product has a defect, so we need to be able to tell which batch it was produced in, which was the raw material that got into that batch, why was that, which was the machine parameter at that time. So all these things has to be analyzed and would help you in your managing your circular economy.
So I don't think we can take more questions now because of paucity of time, but I would like to request you, for the sake of the students, to summarize the skill sets that you foresee they should master to do well in supply chain management.
So basically what my key message would be that don't get lost in the technical jargon. So focus, so develop skill set in one area that you are very confident on and where your interests lie. So if you want to do planning, or then you will have to focus more on big data and analytics. If you are more towards operations, so then you need to focus more on IoT, blockchain, etc. So, and if you want to focus more on a process side, then you focus more on Lean Six Sigma. You could become a generalist as well, focusing on all of them, but I would avoid doing that. I'll first build an expertise in one of core domains and then expand on others.
Very, very comprehensively answered. Thank you so much. So on that note, I would like to conclude this webinar. Thank you so much, Mr. Singh, for joining and sharing your thoughts. I'm very certain that the students and faculty have learned a lot during this session. I would like to thank you on behalf of the entire audience. It's been a pleasure and hope to connect with you soon. Thank you once again.
Thank you, and it was a pleasure speaking to you all, and hope you took away something positive from it. Thank you. Thanks for your time, and have a good day. Bye-bye.